Julianne, and thanks everyone for attending. This has been an amazing course, Critical Race Theory and Politics of Teaching about Racism. We've learned a lot about the efforts of legal scholars to try to understand the systemic racism within our institutions, and to gain some evidence that will inspire and help us to better improve our teaching of history, to be able to understand the role that racism has played in the nation, and to be able to express it in an evidence-based way to build an understanding among our young people as well as our college-age people on appreciating America and what it's about, its challenges, and the hopes for the future. We also learned how the governor and political leaders are trying to take advantage of this situation to impose a certain ideology on the teaching of history and to take into account the fact that there is a backlash against a better understanding of the racism in our history. So the results have been laws that were imposed in Florida, and as we learned in many other states, the efforts of school boards to try to grapple with this situation, and particularly the responses of teachers who are really trying to sincerely teach issues of history, but are afraid for their legal jeopardy, basically. So we've gone through all that, but we haven't heard from what I say is the horse's mouth, an actual high school teacher. And so today we have the honor of having a presentation by Jordan Marlowe. Jordan Marlowe is a teacher at Newberry High School with 17 years of classroom experience in both English and social studies. He teaches AP European history and African American history. He's a fourth-generation farmer. He's married to his beautiful wife. He has 2 children, and he also serves as the mayor of the city of Newberry. So, Mayor Marlowe?
Is it? Good. I will move around a little bit if that's okay. Does the camera need to be on me? Generally, everybody enjoys not actually looking at my face.
I'll be sharing your screen whenever you're ready.
Okay. Well, I want to say thank you for the invitation. I appreciate coming. Is this the last in this series? And, we've been communicating back and forth about this series for quite some time now. And I want to tell you a little bit of a story because I think maybe at this point you guys might be better CRT experts than anyone else in America. A couple of years ago, I was part of the pilot teachers that taught African American history in Alachua County. The city of Newberry has been working on a process of truth and reconciliation for about 5 years now. And we approached the school board and asked for that course to be an offering. Took us a couple of years, but we finally got it. And one night we have a thing called open house, and you can go and you can meet the teachers and take your kid around the school and those kinds of things. And I was introducing the African American history course, and a mom stayed after, and she said, "Now, Mr. Marlowe, do you teach CRT?" And I said, "Well, ma'am, if you can tell me what that is, I'll tell you if I teach it." And to this day, I haven't quite got a really good answer about what CRT is. But then she said something that I thought was telling, and she said, "Well, I just don't want my daughter to learn to hate being white." And I said, I can guarantee you she's not going to learn that from me. Right? So I will tell you, I've been asked to come here and talk a little bit about what it's like to teach race in America right now. And I want to do that by sharing one of the lesson plans that we have developed in Newberry's own process of truth and reconciliation. But before I get into, you can go ahead and put it on the screen, but before I get into that, I want to share with you a story of how not to teach race in America. And I'm going to be talking to you today about something that has come to be known in Newberry's history as the Newberry Six. We've been trying to change that verbiage because we know that there were more people murdered on August 18th in 1916 than just the six. And so we want to pay homage to the fact that we know that there were more folks who lost their lives that day. But I first told that history to a classroom probably about 12 years ago. And it was in preparation for reading To Kill a Mockingbird. Everybody read To Kill a Mockingbird? I got a literate crowd in here today. All right, wonderful. You've all had wonderful English teachers. I'm a big believer that when you read a book, you should learn a little bit about the history of what was going on in the time that author is responding to, reflecting on. And so, fairly brand new teacher, 3-4 years of experience in, I thought, what a wonderful hook, right? What a wonderful way to get the kids engaged in To Kill a Mockingbird than to teach them about our own local history. And so in preparation to teach To Kill a Mockingbird, which the central premise in that book is about a white woman telling a lie on a black man, getting him arrested. The crowd, the community attempted to lynch him, and then eventually he's found guilty, even though Atticus Finch proves he's innocent in a court of law. I said, let me tell this story of Newberry Six, and that will certainly get everyone engaged. So I began to tell this history as much as I know of it at that point in time. This is long before Newberry had been really engaged in uncovering this work. Dr. Patricia Hilliard Nunn had been working with people in Newberry as far back as 2003. So the research was coming out, but we weren't really publicly engaged with it ourselves as a community. So I began to tell this story, and I talk about a man named Boise Long, who I'll introduce you to here in a few minutes. And I talk about, he's the African-American man, and I talk about the deputy who is also killed in this incident. And I'm telling this story, and I think, man, they're engaged, everyone's quiet, everyone's listening. And after the class was over, and I tell the story, and then we start to read the book. After the class, a young black woman comes up to me and she says, Mr. Marlowe, that story that you were telling, that's my family. Then the next day, a young white woman comes to see me, and she says, Mr. Marlowe, that story that you were telling, that's my family. I don't mean to get choked up on you, but I felt so bad. I felt such a failure because there in that classroom, I had sitting right next to each other, two descendants of victimizers and victims, and I had not prepared them for that conversation. I had done such a bad job. And that's how you don't teach race in America. You don't just jump in to this history. You don't just start telling these stories. Because for a town like Newberry, a small town, this is living history. These are people that have lived next to each other. This is trauma that is still alive. These are our secrets that have been kept, voices that have been silenced. And to just jump into that story, what a mistake. And so I had to apologize. The next day in class, I said, guys, I am so sorry. This is traumatic, and I did not pay homage to that trauma. I did not have a conversation with them about what we were going to be talking about how sensitive what we were going to be talking about is, about how we should go about this kind of conversation. To me, this was a 100-year-old historical story that helped contextualize a fictional book. And so I have, for about 3 or 4 years, I didn't teach that history because I didn't know how to go about doing it. But then in 2017, Newberry decided that we were going to face that truth. We met together as a community and we voted as a community to engage in truth and reconciliation. And the community had two questions. They said, what are we going to do? How are we going to teach this history to kids? That's the topic of our conversation today. How are we going to teach this history? And then they also wanted to know, what are we going to do about Dudley Farm? And at that point in time, I didn't realize what a sore spot the state park that's in the city of Newberry was for the African-American community in Newberry. Again, through my perspective, it's a state farm. It's showing life in a certain period of time in America. And so I had to be educated on why Dudley Farm was so offensive to a lot of the African-Americans in my community. As a teacher, I kind of jumped right on how we're going to teach this history to the kids because I felt like that was my wheelhouse. And it took me a couple of years, but I was able to make some partnerships with the University of Florida. And so one of the efforts was, let's create a curriculum to teach the history of the Newberry lynchings. Before I go through this with you, I just want to let you know ahead of time that there are some graphic images in this. There are some things that should be disturbing. I think one of the problems with the governor's anti-woke legislation is the vagueness of the language in it. You can't teach anything that makes kids uncomfortable. Well, I don't particularly know how to gauge that, and I don't know that I necessarily want my students to be comfortable with this history. I think when we're teaching about the Holocaust, when we're teaching about certain parts of history, there is a certain level of uncomfortableness that you want the students to feel, right? We want to be uncomfortable with these things. I think that's what we're hoping is one of the factors that will prevent them happening again. So I just want to be clear about that. If anyone feels like today's not the day for those kinds of images or that kind of conversation, I won't be offended if you go back and you just take yourself out. I will understand. So this is a lesson that I teach in class. How did one small town engage in this conversation? And so sometimes I'm giving this presentation, people don't quite know where Newberry is. So I want to orient most people to orient by Gainesville. And so I say, well, we're just outside of Gainesville to the west there. So Newberry we're about 8,000 population. We've been growing pretty rapidly. When I graduated from Newberry High School, I think our population was about 4,000. So we've doubled the size in the course of my life. I won't tell you how old I am now. So our challenge was, how are we going to teach this history to our kids in a way that teaches them about the present? I'm a history teacher. I love history for the sake of history. But if we're not learning something from our past that helps us redefine and reimagine today, then I think we're missing the mark. I want my children to know our family's history so that they understand who we are and what we value as a family today. I want my community to understand Newberry's history so that we understand the same thing. But that is a challenge. In a world of standardized tests, in a world where the test rules, then I think, often lose sight that the whole point of learning history is to better understand who we are right now. And so how do we work our way through the standardized tests and the bureaucracy to make sure that kids are learning about this past so that when we have a conversation about Black Lives Matter or CRT or whether or not we're going to teach AP African American history in the state of Florida, it's not a isolated conversation. It's put in the context of a conversation that's been happening since the beginning of America, since before the beginning of America. So just to give you a little bit of the history of the Newberry lynchings, this is a story that starts, and I think it's on the next slide. We never have collectively discussed it. And I can tell you a personal story. When I was about 5 or 6 years old, I was sitting in my grandparents' kitchen. And my grandparents were definitely of the generation where you didn't speak unless you were spoken to. You sat quietly, right, until someone addressed you. And they had clearly forgotten that I was in the room. They were around the kitchen table. They had some company over. And they began to talk about this incident. And my grandfather said something to the lines of, well, it got out of control, and that was real shame what they did to the colored people, because in his generation, the term colored was a polite term. That was how you politely referred to African Americans. And then my grandmother hushed him, and that was her mistake. because that's when I zeroed in. I knew they were talking about something that they didn't want me to hear, because to that point, I was not really paying attention. But then once she said, hush, 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 I knew, oh, there's something going on here that I should know about. That's the only memory I have as a child of learning about the history of the Newberry Six and the history of the Newberry lynchings. So, but it also lets me know that this is a history that they were well aware of. They knew about this history, and they were making the conscious decision not to tell me. Now, I've never have, and I'm just realizing this, I've never asked my father if they ever talked to him about it. But I'm going to do that today when I leave here. I'm going to call him up and I'm going to ask him that question. And I'm going to say, you guys put me up to it. But I'm going to ask him, so we know that this was known, that there was a collective consciousness in the city of Newberry that these events had happened. But we also know that there was a collective decision to not talk about it, to keep these things in the past, keep these things hidden. So what happened is on August 17th, and here already stories are going to begin to diverge, ASO sends out a deputy called Deputy Wynn. And Deputy Wynn goes to the home of a man named Boise Long. Now, Boise Long had a common law wife who was pregnant at the time. And Deputy Wynn shows up at Boise Long's house at about 2:00 in the morning. Now, the report is that he was there to question him on the suspicion of stealing hogs. To this day, if you go to the ASO website and you look on their website of heroes, where every deputy who's lost his life or her life in Alachua County, it says that he was there to serve a warrant for arrest for stealing hogs. We've never been able to find that warrant. And we've asked, just produce the warrant. We'll gladly accept that there was a warrant. So the most that we know is that he was there to question him on the suspicion of stealing hogs. And I think there's a couple of really salient points to make about that. One, 2 a.m. is a strange time for an officer to show up to your house to ask you some questions. It's very odd to come at 2 a.m. in the morning. If I just want to ask you some questions, that's usually a 5 o'clock. It's an afternoon. I catch you on your lunch break. I want to ask you some questions. 2 a.m. is a little bit suspicious of a time to just show up. I think another really important point that a lot of people who are urban folks who don't live in cities know is that hogs are one of the cheapest animal you can grow. They are very prolific. And just about everybody in the surrounding areas in this time period would have had hogs. So horse thieving, horses are very valuable, very expensive. That makes a lot of sense. Stealing cows, that is a long tradition of cattle thieving. That makes sense. Suspicion of stealing hogs is less, it's like being a chicken thief, right? I mean, it would be a sort of a low level, what's going on here. So we'll never really know because that part of the story never gets brought out. The other strange thing is that Deputy Wynn brings a doctor along with him. So he doesn't bring another cop. He doesn't bring a backup. He brings a buddy with him who happens to be a doctor. And the last strange thing that happens is that somehow Deputy Wynn gets into Boise Long's bedroom, and the deputy wakes up Boise Long. So, and none of those are really disputed parts. Everyone agrees that. So it's not really clear how the deputy got in. Did he knock on the door? Did Boise Long's wife let him in? How did he get into the bedroom? Generally, I think if I'm asleep at 2 a.m. and my wife answers the door, she's going to invite the officer to stay in the living room while she goes into the bedroom and wakes me up, gives me the opportunity to collect myself, those kinds of things. But the deputy gets into Boise Long's bedroom, and it's the deputy that wakes him up. Now, at that point, the stories do diverge. Boise Long says at the trial that happens later on that he knew he was dead, that they were there to kill him. And so he fought back. The officer said that he drew the gun first and they had to fire in self-defense. He ends up shooting, Boise Long shoots the deputy in the stomach and he shot the doctor in the hand, and he is able to escape. And so he escapes. Deputy Wynn dies on a train to Jacksonville because that was the closest hospital. So they get Deputy Wynn onto a train, they send him to Jacksonville, he dies on the way. Now, the important part about Deputy Wynn is that he happens to be the baby brother of Mama Dudley, the matriarch of Dudley Farm. And this is, she has almost raised him. She has a very matronly, motherly affection for Deputy Wynn. And in her sadness and grief, she is the one that instigates the mob to band together to go out and find Boise Long. So Boise Long has managed to get away. He's hiding somewhere in the woods. The officers can't find him. And Mama Dudley is very upset about this. The Dudleys were a very prominent family in the city of Newberry area. Everyone sort of knew the Dudleys. They went through, they were the post office, they were the general store. So they had a lot of clout. And I think that's the thing that I had to learn to understand why the Newberry lynchings were intimately wound up in the Dudley Farm story, because I didn't know that, right? No one, when I took the field trip to Dudley Farm myself, right, we just learned about how the Dudleys were a pioneering family who forged their way in a forest and became very prominent. We didn't really talk a lot about slavery. We didn't talk about Jim Crow. Those kinds of things were sort of left out. So that's the basic story of the Newberry lynchings. And it's the details get a little bit clouded, but because the mob could not find Boise Long, they began to collect Boise Long's family, friends. They took his pregnant common law wife, a woman named Stella. They took his preacher, and they took 6 people that we know of that we can verify. One on Dudley, one gentleman, McHill, resisted, and he shot in the back with a shotgun. He is reported in the newspaper as dying by barbed wire. The other 5, they were able to apprehend, and they held in the Newberry jails. And then later on the night of August 18th, they went and took the people out of the jail, and they took them to an area in Newberry that was known as Lynch Hammock, and that's where they hung them until they were dead. So that's the story. We're going to go a little bit more into it, but that's the history that we will use to sort of compare to try to understand what's going on today. Because that's remember, that's always the goal, is how do we learn from history to help us understand today? So this is the Wikipedia. This is a beginning of the Wikipedia. If you type in Newberry 6, this is what you'll get. The events began with the attempt late August 17th by Newberry Constable George Wynn to serve a warrant on Boise Long, an African-American man, for stealing hogs. Now, if we go to the Ahmaud Arbery incident that happened in 2019, if we look at some of the same language, some of the same verbiage, some of the same phrasing, right? Attorneys for the McMichaels have argued that the father and son believed Arbery was the burglary suspect who had been stealing items. So at this point, I can ask the students, how did both of these incidents begin in the news? How are both of these incidents reported? Do you see a similarity there? Do you see a way that the story is begun? And I'm sure, as all of you would say, they both begin with placing the blame on the black man, right? So the very first thing we do is once you point this out to the kids, we do a current events in that class every Friday, and they will bring in newspaper headlines, articles, journals, things that they find, and they start pointing it out to me. They'll say, "See, Mr. Marlowe, look at this headline. They're saying this was the black woman's fault. Look at this one," right? The story of Officer Wynn being inside the classroom, very reminiscent of the Breonna Taylor story, right? The officers, the whole conflict there is, did the officers announce themselves? Did they say we're law enforcement? Did they identify themselves before they went into the house? Same issue in the Boise Long. How did the officer get into Boise Long's bedroom without being announced, without announcing it at law enforcement? So once we begin to see how these things are phrased, the kids can begin to put this together. They say, well, what's the reason? What's the importance of making sure that we cast some doubt on somebody before we go any further in the conversation? What does that do? In a country where we're innocent till proven guilty, what does it do to the public to start every story with some suspicion of some something illegal happening. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with the Ahmaud Arbery case, if you talked about that, if you followed that. I remember that one happening sort of in real time. And it began with Ahmaud Arbery was suspected of being a carjacker. And then when it came out that only one instance of carjacking had been reported from the neighborhood that was claiming a rash of carjackings, the conversation shifted and they found a video of Ahmaud Arbery on a jog, and he walked into a house under construction. And then it was, well, he's suspected of trespassing. And what was he doing? Why was he in the house? And I always bring that example up because one of my father's favorite activities to do, because he loves to build houses, is to go to neighborhoods that are under construction and walk through the houses that are under construction. And I remember asking him as a child, is this trespassing? And he says, well, there's no door. And I said, well, what a wonderful way to live life in America, right? And what a wonderful privilege as a white man to be able to walk through a construction area and look at different models of homes and just look at them with the eye of, do I like that bay window or do I like this setup? And not have to worry about being accused of being a trespasser or being murdered later on and then being blamed for that, right? So, we always try to show here's what happened in history and here's some similarities of things that have happened that are going on right now. And I think we can get into some of those a little bit later on. I'm sorry, I should have given you a forewarning before I show that. And can you remind me of my time here? I want to be respectful of everybody's. I can talk a lot faster, or we can go into some more. So you just okay. So just as a forewarning, I apologize. The next scene is where we will begin to look at some of the photographic evidence that we have to show that the Newberry lynchings did happen. Will the laser work? It does. So one of the Newberry lynchings, as far as we can tell, and I know there's some historians in the room, so I'm a little nervous about stating facts, but as far as we know, the Newberry lynchings is the largest mass lynching that occurred in the state of Florida. I think there's 5 documented murders in the Rosewood story. We know there are more people that were murdered in Rosewood. We know that there were more people that were murdered in the Newberry lynchings, but we can't prove it. And one of the institute in America that is at the leading edge of this research is called the Equal Justice Initiative. Newberry has partnered with them, but they have very, very strict guidelines on what counts to document lynchings. And Alachua County and EJI right now are in a conflict. EJI acknowledges, I think they're willing to acknowledge about 30 of the lynchings in Alachua County. Alachua County has discovered about 46. And the difference there is that we have some evidence, but we haven't verified it from multiple sources. And EJI says you got to have at least three different documented sources to count. So for instance, Boise Long in the Newberry lynchings, he will turn himself in 2 days later after his family is murdered, his preacher is murdered, because somebody gets to him and says, hey, they're murdering everybody. They're killing all of your family and friends. So he goes and turns himself in. He's held at the Hippodrome Theater. That was the courthouse back in the day. Newberry, there was a play that talked about the Newberry lynchings called Newberry. They separated out the Newberry. And it was that happened in 21, I want to say, maybe it was the beginning of 22. That was very compelling because we were watching a play in the Hippodrome, the place where Boise Long would have been tried. And then by all accounts, he was executed, on the steps of the Hippodrome in the plaza in front of it right before them. So we went back roughly 100 years later to that site to retell that story. So we do have photographic evidence. The bodies were left hanging for 3 days by oral history accounts. People came from Gainesville, they came from Alachua, they came from High Springs, they came from Trenton. Parades came by. The Lynch Hammock, if you're not familiar with Newberry, is about a quarter mile away from the African American school. So Newberry was segregated just like Gainesville was. There was a white school, there was a black school. And Lynch Hammock is in very, very close proximity to the black school. And I take my kids on a field trip and we go to the white school, which is still in Newberry. It's a beautiful red brick 2-story building. It has floor to ceiling windows. It's been renovated. It's been kept up. And in that school, we read Plessy versus Ferguson. And then I take them to the black school, which is really just the cafeteria, because the school itself was left to go into disrepair. And there we read Brown v. Board of Education. And we talk about, what did you see? Was this separate but equal? What did the white kids get? What did the black kids get? But think about the trauma that happened to black students who had to walk by bodies hanging in the trees on their way to school. Think about the lesson that the white community is teaching them, because a key component of lynchings is that it's racial terror. It's not just I'm murdering someone for some perceived crime or social transgression. It's that you don't know exactly why you're being killed, and I'm going to torture and humiliate your body in a very public and visible way, so that the neighborhood knows what happens to people who get out of line, whatever the line is. And that part is really crucial, right? That black people during Jim Crow didn't usually understand why they're being punished. They know what the accusation is, but was it for failing to say yes, sir, in an appropriate deference? Was it a social transgression? Those kinds of things. This man right here is Senator Rowland. It was his great-great-granddaughter who was in the classroom the day that I blew it. This man, and I wish I had Janice here, this man is the sheriff, Palachi County Sheriff is there. And these 3 gentlemen are Dudley children. So there's roughly 200 people that show up for the murder. 3 days later, they come back and take the bodies down, and they take the picture with them. So what I want my students to know about that is that if you have an elected senator who's willing to pose with bodies, what does that tell you about the people who are voting for him? What does that tell you about the demographics that he's worried about in getting reelected? Is he going, is this something that he's proud of? Is this something he's trying to hide from? Is this something that he wants the community to know about because he thinks that this will get him votes? And we generally make some comparisons to political speeches in, pre-Nazi Germany, where people are being openly anti-Semitic because they believe that their crowd that they're talking to are also anti-Semitical, and that these thoughts are common in place enough, and that they're actually going to garner them votes. That by showing this and participating here is going to be something that they can use on the campaign trail. They don't have to hide from it. Now, I told you the story of my grandparents, my grandmother hushing my grandfather and saying, no, don't talk about that. Oral history tells us that when they took the bodies down, that the white mob took an oath of silence and agreed in that moment that they would not talk about this and they would keep it quiet. There was one white man who didn't take the oath, and he was run out of town, and he had to leave. He was not welcome in Newberry anymore. And if you look at Newberry's history, the Newberry lynchings really crashed the city of Newberry. This was such a traumatic moment I believe, for both Black people and white people, certainly more traumatic for Black people than white people. But really nothing happens economically in Newberry for about 20 years. Nobody wants to come to Newberry. This is the site. This got headline news across the country about a racial mass murder. People are very afraid of Newberry. I speak to people today that still tell me that, I just feel weird about Newberry. I don't know why. I've heard things, or it's got this long, dark history that isn't really talked about. And to be fair, we didn't talk about it for a long time. But to also be fair, we have talked about it an awful lot since 2017. We've been talking as much as we can talk about this history, trying to get these details sorted out. So, I want my kids to know, I want my students to know that when we talk about not talking about things, That's not everybody not talking about it. That's white people agreeing to be silent on these parts of history. That's white people deciding these things aren't going to be put in the textbooks. Black people have always been talking about these things. They've been passing down that oral history. Now that problematizes, it makes it difficult because it means that because it's not written down, we're going to have gaps. We're going to have things that we don't know. We're going to have stories that don't quite align. And that's problematic. And that's why we are so thankful to the people who are engaged in this work. This is a city marker as you come into the city of Newberry. That failure to acknowledge that history, that failure to talk about these things, I think problematizes our motto, which is no longer our motto. But our motto is embracing the past, enhancing the future. And certainly I think that the people that wrote that motto, they're thinking about our agricultural heritage. They're thinking about the men and women who served with distinction in the United States military. Newberry does have a long and proud, there's lots of things. I'm a proud Newberryan. I wouldn't have run for mayor if I didn't believe that my city has a lot to offer. But one of the things I'm proudest of my city is that the city of Newberry is also the first city to engage in truth and reconciliation. We went to Montgomery, Alabama. We forged a partnership with EJI. And when Alachua County sought to seek a partnership with EJI, EJI told Alachua County that they had to come and work with Newberry because they already had a partnership with Newberry, and they can only have one partnership at a time. So I think that Newberry's willingness, albeit late to the game, but Newberry's willingness to acknowledge these things and talk about them openly, I think that is something that we should be proud of. So we needed to change that, or we needed to actually embrace it and embrace all of the past, which we'll probably come back to that thought when we get into topics like AP African American history. So we wanted to engage in the process of truth and reconciliation. We've been doing that since 2017. And we wanted to have those sincere conversations. You know, how do we talk about Black Lives Matter as a social national movement and contextualize it and situate it in a historical frame? How do we understand where that kind of anger comes from, where that kind of frustration comes from? Because if I just think that this just boiled up and just started, a couple of years ago, then it would be really difficult to understand why some people are so mad. Understanding the history and understanding, how long certain demographics in our country have been trying to have these conversations and been shut down, I think helps us understand. So I think one of the things that I want to tell my students is that there has been some frustration with me in the city of Newberry from the African American community, and they get a little bit upset that that this conversation is getting so much attention now. And I think that the reason that is the case is because how long have Black people in Newberry asked to have this conversation, do you think? 100 years. I would say probably since August 19th, 1918. They've been wanting justice. They've been wanting to talk about it. When did we start talking about it? When this white boy said we should talk about it. That's got to be frustrating, right? That's got to be frustrating. And so I understand. I get it. I can't change being white, and I can't change also thinking that we need to talk about this. Those are two truths, but I can understand why that frustration would be there, that we have been asking to have this conversation forever, right? And why did we have to wait for a white mayor to say that we should have this conversation for anyone to listen? I think another sincere conversation, I told you that I take my kids to, we call it the Little Red Schoolhouse. That was the white school. Beautiful building. We've spent hundreds of thousands of dollars renovating it, restoring it, keeping it up. We've put maybe $20,000 in preserving the African American school. Now, is that part of systemic racism? Is that a legacy of valuing one group's history more than another? I don't know. I have to ask myself some hard questions about that. Why does the community get so behind preserving the white segregated school And very few people in my community even know it's been turned into a park. It's named after our first African-American mayor, a man named Freddie Wormack. Very few people even know that that was the segregated black school. So you can still see today what we value, where we put our tax dollars, what we put our money into renovating, what we preserve. We can still see the legacy of those discrepancies today. Those, to me, are sincere conversations. I don't know the answer, and that's what makes a conversation sincere. Now we're communicating back and forth. What do you think this is? Which is why, I think it's difficult to nail down what critical race theory is, because when you're engaged in those kinds of conversations, they may lead you to uncomfortable places, and they should lead you to some uncomfortable places. Because if I go into a conversation and I already have the right answer, in my mind, you're free to disagree with me. In my mind, I'm not educating you at that point. Now I'm telling you what the right answer is. And that to me gets dangerously close to indoctrination, not education. I don't know how many of you in here have ever read Mein Kampf. Anybody in here read, do you know what Mein Kampf is? Mein Kampf is the book that Hitler wrote. It's probably the worst, most influential book in history, but he has a chapter on education. And if you want to be disturbed, read that chapter on education in light of the conversation that we're having here, because he advocates openly that you should not tell kids multiple answers. You should tell them the right answer. That way, when they go out into the world and people challenge them with new ideas, they won't be tempted by those ideas. They'll know the right answer. And to me, that's the opposite of education. I want my students to challenge me. I want them to push back. How many of you were alive before the internet? I was actually almost alive before the internet. I was certainly alive before it was what it is today. The world is changing so fast now. What value do I bring to a 15-year-old? What can I tell him about what the future will be? I don't know what the future is going to be. I was trained in a college 20 years ago, just gave myself away, right? I'm teaching kids in high school for a world that they're going to graduate to and go to college. That world's 10 years away. What can I teach them? I can teach them communication. I can teach them critical thinking skills. I can teach them how to question. Those things are forever. Those things are endearing. Not much else is, right? And I have to recognize it's a humbling thought as a teacher. What do I have to offer to this generation that's going to be valuable in a few years? And this, I think, is, right? Understanding the mistakes that we've made, understanding how we can use that information to approach what's going on today. That is something I think that they will be able to use 20 years from now, 30 years from now, 40 years from now. So education in the classroom, those were right off the bat. I was very lucky in being able to partner with the University of Florida to help write this curriculum. I've tried to fess up and tell you that I did a bad job when I was on my own. So I went and got better teachers to help me create a curriculum that could do this in a comprehensive way. And we, at this point, we've been able to get the curriculum. We piloted it in 3 schools in Alachua County. Then last year, it's now in every American history classroom in Alachua County. It's at least available for the teachers. We presented it at the National Social Studies Conference. It had the highest attendance of any presentation at the national conference that year. We also presented it to Dublin, at a conference in Dublin, Ireland. So at this point, the history of the Newberry lynchings has gone global. We've been able to share this history around the world. And to me, that was always a goal. I think we do a disservice. I don't want to get off on another topic, but I think we do a disservice to this period when we just focus on Little Rock 9, we just focus on 2 or 3 incidences, and that allows us all to sort of collectively think, well, I wasn't in Alabama, I wasn't in Mississippi, this isn't in my backyard, this isn't my issue. So it kind of lets us all off the hook. What we need to be doing is going into every little town and uncovering the history of that little town. And that way we all can collectively understand that we're all swimming in the same sea. We've all been raised in a country that sees everything through race. Hairstyles, Is there a racial element to hairstyles? Yeah. Food, clothing, music, sports. Who plays golf? White kids or black kids? Who plays basketball? There aren't really good answers to those, but we have the stereotypes, right? So when people say, are we racist? I say, well, if you want to be real technical about it, we are all racist, right? Because we've all been raised in a country that has taught us to see every single thing through the eyes of race, right? So we have to acknowledge that so that we can then have conversations about why are black women getting so irritated when people come up and pet their hair, right? Well, if I need to do a little learning to be able to have that conversation. So we were able to get it into the schools in the 2021 year, and it's there now. And we are asking kids to explore that legacy of lynchings and racial violence. And I asked the kids on day one, did it this year, who knows what a lynching is? How many of you think you have a good definition of what counts as a lynching? You can raise your hand, don't be shy. Nobody, that's okay, that's good, that's okay too. Generally speaking, I only have one or two kids put their hand in the air. And those kids generally tend to think that a lynching is just hanging someone from a tree and it's murder that way. And there's a pretty clear definition of what counts as a lynching. It has to be two or more people that gather together. It's extrajudicial, so the person murdered doesn't get a judge, doesn't get a jury, doesn't get a trial, which is why Boise Long, even though he is murdered judiciously by the state a few months later, he doesn't get counted in the Newberry lynchings because he got a judge, he got a jury, he got an attorney. The jury went out for 6 minutes. It went out for 6 minutes. I've never been a smoker, but I imagine that's about the time it took that jury to smoke one cigarette and go back in and say guilty. And I think that any reasonable person would probably say that wasn't a fair trial. So I think that one of the next things that we should look at, and I think Alachua County should look at this because EJI is not, is we have done a lot of work on extrajudicial lynchings, but we haven't done very much work at all on how many people were judiciously murdered by the state. Let's do that kind of work as well. That's also problematic, probably pretty controversial. It's probably going to make some folks uncomfortable. But when you add those numbers to the 4,600 victims that we have documented right now, which is, again, that's low. 4,600 is EJI's number. And Alachua County, one county alone, has at least 15 that EJI is not accepting. And I should have started with this. This is an important stat to know. If you had to pick a state in Florida that had the most lynchings per capita, what state do you think it would be? Alabama? Mississippi? It's actually Florida. Florida had the most lynchings per capita of any state in America. Marion County had the highest number, and Alachua County had the second highest number. So when you think about this work, we're living in the heart of this work. And I think that, that lets Florida off the hook a little bit, right? Because the stories that we hear are about Mississippi, they're about Alabama, and Florida needs to do a better job. I think maybe Ocoee and Rosewood probably are the two stories that if you're engaged in this kind of literature, you might know about. But Newberry lynchings go under the radar. People don't know about that. So those kinds of things. So we're asking, why are certain histories in the history books? Why are certain histories not in the history books? Who's making the choice of what to put in the history books? Who's making the choice of what to leave out of the history books? And then we talk about what does that phrase truth and reconciliation mean? I remember being asked that question in 2017 by my community, very much in a room just like this. And they said, so do we want to engage in this process of truth and reconciliation? They said, well, what is it? And I said, well, I don't know. And I think that the answer to that is it's absolutely 100% up to each community that wants to do it. That it should be individualized based on the history of the community and what they want to do And I can share a little bit about other things that we've done, but these are the kinds of questions that we talk to, or I talk to my students about. So in the lesson plan, I'm actually in the middle of this lesson plan right now. And we spent the first 3 days not talking about the history at all. We spent the first 3 days talking about what does it mean to say that a topic in history is a difficult topic? What does that mean? You know, it's history. It's 100 years ago. Why is it difficult now? And I think when something is difficult, we should ask that question. Why, right? Why is this difficult for us to talk about? Why do we have an emotional attachment here? Why are people screaming at school boards on both sides of the aisle, right, about this issue? I'm a very unemotional kind of guy. I guess I didn't really show that when I broke down a little bit, but generally speaking, I'm a pretty unemotional person. And so I have a hard time when people are really that angry. You know, what causes that much anger? We talk about why the silence. What does silence mean? And I ask my students to consider infidelity in a marriage. I say, guys, imagine a couple that's been married for 10, 15 years. And imagine that let's just pick on men. Imagine that the man cheats on the wife, but doesn't say he's sorry. And he doesn't even tell her. She finds out somewhere else. How do you think that marriage has a shot? You think they're going to stick together, or you think they're going to get divorced? And they all, no, that marriage is over. They're going to get divorced. I say, okay, imagine the same situation, but the husband comes to the wife and he says, yeah, I just want to let you know I cheated on you, but we got to move on. You know, it's in the past, in the past. I want to think about, let's focus on tomorrow, right? How do you think that marriage is going to last? Still, no. That's okay. Imagine, same couple, man comes to the wife and he says, I have something I have to tell you. I feel really bad about this. And I need to tell you that I've stepped outside marriage, and I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. I want to work on this. Do you think that marriage stands a chance? Yeah, right? That marriage is the only one that probably stands a chance. Well, what's the difference in America, right? We have an institution of slavery. We have Jim Crow. And then we have a period of silence where one side refuses to acknowledge that it even happened, didn't happen. I say, tell me the American president that has apologized for slavery. Tell me the president that has said, as a nation, we're going to do this work. We have work to do, trauma to heal, right? So out of the marriage scenario, where are we as a country? And do we have a chance to reconcile together if we don't admit what happened, acknowledge it, say we're sorry, and say, I want to work together? How do we heal each other so that tomorrow we can have a more honest conversation? And I'm sorry if I'm giving you too many analogies, but when you're dealing with high school kids, you got to put it in words in a frame that they can kind of understand. So why is it, let's talk about the silence, right? When people don't want to talk about something, I think that's kind of a tell, right? And then I ask them, right, should we talk about this? And it's kind of amazing how many Black students say, no, we shouldn't talk about this. There was only one person at that community meeting in 2017 that said we shouldn't engage in truth and reconciliation. It was an elderly Black woman. And her reason, she was very clear. She said, this is going to open up old wounds. This is going to be painful. We shouldn't embark on this journey. Now, she was in the minority. Everyone else wanted to have this conversation, but I will never forget that stance. Now, privately, I've had white people come and tell me, Mayor, why are you digging this stuff up? This is in the past. You should leave it in the past. Everyone's getting along better now. Let's just move along, right? Let's not pick at these scabs. But to me, if I go back to the marriage analogy, if we don't do that work, the marriage is still rotten, right? We still have this trauma. We still are not being honest with each other. We're still not. We're lying to each other, right? So, but it is amazing how many students say, I don't think we should talk about this, right? We should just move on. And I'm still struggling. I'd love to hear y'all's feedback. I don't know how interactive this is supposed to be, but I'd love to hear y'all's ideas about that question. Should we talk about this now? And then we talk about, why does this matter, right? Why does it matter today to have these conversations? And then I show them pictures of Black Lives Matter marches. I show them headlines, some of the rhetoric that we're hearing, and how it could help. So you don't need to read all of this, but basically the unit is going to zoom out, right? We're going to take a big picture look at white supremacy, Jim Crow laws. This is the time in the lesson plan that I talk about Daughters of the Confederation and the work that they did to get Confederate statues put up all over America and to write history books where they recast the South as sort of a states' rights, and this really had nothing to do with slavery. This was about the Constitution and who was in charge, state governments or federal governments. Then we zoom in on Newberry and the Newberry lynchings, and we talk about the process of truth and reconciliation. Then we zoom back out on Black Lives Matter law enforcement, which is a very, very sensitive subject in Newberry. Newberry High School is the criminal justice magnet. So I have kids whose parents are in law enforcement. I have kids who are going into law enforcement. And then here we are needing to have a very sensitive conversation about instances of police brutality to African Americans. What does that look like? Where is it stemming from? How can we address it? What does it mean? Those kinds of things. So we have to, I expect the students to come away with a definition of what lynching is. I expect them, I hope that this evokes some strong emotions about the difficult pieces of our history, the difficult knowledge of our history. And then we spend some time talking about how we're going to talk about this collectively. Because what I don't want is that situation, because this year I have another descendant of the victim family in class with me. I don't have a descendant of the victimizers. So we spend a lot of time talking about, what are we going to say, African American? Are we going to say Black? Let's have that conversation. When we talk about lynchings, are we going to address the ever so present question of, well, tell me what they did to get lynched? That was the very first public comment I got. The very first time I made a comment on the Newberry lynchings, a white man stood up and he said, well, what did they do to get lynched? And, we have to have that conversation about, that's the terror part of racial terror lynchings, is that maybe you didn't have to do anything. If you know the story of Ida B. Wells, that was her light bulb moment, right? Because she writes very sincerely about her life story, about how she too, a Black woman, felt that, well, I've heard about all these things, but clearly these people are doing something about it. They're doing something that is putting them in this situation, until she was asked to go into a different train car. And she said, no, I'm a lady, I'm in the ladies' car. And they physically removed her with some force into the other car. And she tried to fight it in court, didn't go anywhere. And that was her moment of realizing that maybe we don't have to do anything for these things to happen to us. So we have that conversation about, sometimes white students in here are going to need to ask questions. And just when they need to ask a question, guys, we got to support the question and not get mad and call them a racist or get upset with them for asking questions, because at least they're brave enough to raise their hand and say, I'm trying to have a conversation about race. And that's a hard thing to do these days, to have a conversation about race. I don't know how heated y'all's conversations get at the dinner table here, if you even broach it. But generally, I find people work really hard to avoid conversations of race and politics these days. But race for sure. We're so afraid of being called a racist. We're so afraid of having these conversations. So we have that conversation. How are we going to do this? And then we talk about a wide variety of ways that you can participate. So if you're anxious about raising your hand, you can write in a journal. You can leave questions anonymously as you leave the class, and we can address them the next day. And then we talk about those interests and concerns. My dad's a cop. Are we gonna be bashing cops in here? Is that what this is about? My ancestor is a victim here. Are we going to be blaming the Black people for this situation? And so we talk about the history of lynching and racial violence. We bring it back to home. We talk about memorials. Clearly, we've had a lot of conversations about Confederate statues here in Alachua County and Confederate flags. So we've got lots of examples to use. Then we go to current events. I bring in a lot of songs. There's a lot of music out there, pop culture, that's dealing with this in a way that that resonates with the kids much better than I can. And then we get to what can we do collectively as a class? What can we do as young people? What can we expect? How can we move forward together and try to be anti-racist? So that's a kind of a summary of a lesson plan that we teach. When we first made this was before the anti-woke. This was before the AP African American History. I remember in 2017, people coming to me and saying, "Mayor, you are so brave to do this." And I thought, it's 2017, right? Nobody's burning a cross on my yard. Right? It's 2017. This is easy, right? This doesn't take bravery. Since then, the world's changed a little bit. The world's gotten a little less clear in education. And, I'm in a unique situation. At Newberry High School, I've been there long enough that I'm still tenured. So I have a little bit of protection on that front. But it's a strange situation to be a white man teaching an African-American history class, to be a white mayor as the face of this movement. And I try to acknowledge that. But when you have laws that are really strangely written, they identify things as, well, if a kid feels uncomfortable, then the parent can sue the teacher directly. I can certainly understand why young teachers wouldn't go into the profession. You're not making a whole lot of money anyway. And so knowing that parents could sue you, not the school board, not the school, but they can sue you over being made to feel uncomfortable, well, it's a hard one, right? And it's hard to have that standard in African American history, but not in teaching Nazi Germany, not in teaching Native American history. There's a whole lot of areas that we're not being judged by that standard. And so I can understand that level of discomfort. And then I don't understand the AP African American history stance at all. That one kind of gets me because Governor DeSantis is as a conservative, he's all about choice. He's all about empowering people to make choices. But AP courses aren't mandatory; they're voluntary. I teach 6 AP classes. None of them are mandatory. Every student who's in one of my classes is there because he or she has selected to challenge themselves. So, outlawing AP African American history really only limits the choices of people who may want to take that class. I teach 6 AP classes, and I can tell you that I don't use a textbook in any of them. So to say that the curriculum is the reason that it fails to meet educational standards, I find that to be a spurious argument as well, because College Board never comes into my classroom and says, well, you're not teaching the book we want you to teach. We want you to teach it this way. AP teachers have a lot of autonomy. I can teach these subjects in any way that I think is best for the audience that I have. So I think that, that one I struggle with a lot, because I just think it's an ideological divergence for the governor. And I think that ideological divergence shows us that we're not talking about the real issue. And the real issue is, why can't we teach this subject? That's what we should be talking about. What are we afraid of in this subject in particular? I don't know, is there an opportunity to people to ask questions? I feel like I've talked a lot, and I'd love to answer some questions.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Do I need to turn this?
No.
Leave it on. I think that you've responded to many of the issues that we've discussed in this course, and then some. And so we have quite a bit of time to have people respond to what you've brought up, as well as to ask you questions, both online and here in Okemuk. So please raise your hand if you'd like to speak.
This shows my ignorance, but I didn't realize that AP courses were optional. That's a big deal, since, you know, if you don't want to feel uncomfortable, you don't have to take the course.
To me, and I've given a lot of interviews at this point, and I've yet to talk to a reporter that knew that.
Well, then that makes me feel better.
You so you're not. I don't think everyone thinks that, you know, we're forcing kids to sit into this class, and we're not. I teach AP European History, I teach AP Research, AP Seminar, AP Lit, AP Lang, AP Human Geography. You know, and all of those classes they're all academic electives. So the student or the parent has said, hey, you're going to go challenge yourself in that one. But there's 11 AP classes at Newberry High School. You don't have to take all 11. So
I agree with everything you're doing, but my sense is that your curriculum would be not in compliance with either the state law or the governor's policy. Does that concern you?
I think that kind of goes along with the first comment in chat up there. Are you going to be able to continue to teach it?
If the governor wants to come to my classroom, I would welcome him. And I wouldn't change a thing about what I teach or what I say or how I present it. Sometimes I think that they're just fights that you have to have. We can agree to disagree, but sometimes we just have to, you know, stand our ground on certain issues. So I'm not going to change what I teach. And if the governor disagrees, and I also think that when the governor wants to start funding public education, then I would love to hear his opinion on other things in public education. But, you know, it seems to me that politicians, and I am one, so I get to make fun of them, politicians only ever want to get involved in the one thing that teachers are actually pretty good at, which is designing the curriculum. Teachers struggle at classroom management. They're not behaviorists. We're not managers of the school, so payroll and those kinds of things, that's not our wheelhouse. But teaching a subject, that's what we're trained to do. That's what we go to college to learn how to do. I don't need anybody to help me learn or help me figure out a lesson plan to teach. All the other things, I need smaller class sizes. I need that help. I need more equipment. I need better resources. I'm trying to take my students on a field trip to Montgomery, Alabama. It would be great if the school board paid for the bus. How fantastic would that be? I take kids to Europe every other summer. I used to do every summer, then I'd take a break. And after teaching a whole year of AP European history, when do the kids come alive? When you're standing in Versailles, right? You're like, hey, remember that guy I taught you about, Louis the 14th, right? This is his house, right? And then they get it, right? Then it all comes alive. So, you know, what would it be like to be able to take kids to Alabama, take kids, you know, to see this kind of history? So it doesn't concern me. But I'm a farmer. So if they fire me out of the classroom, I'll go back to the farm. There's like a 50,000 teacher shortage in Florida right now. So, you know, do you want me to answer?
Well, let me go to Anne Marie. You've been waiting patiently. Go ahead, Anne Marie.
Oh, I put it in the chat because I didn't know if you would get to it or not. But I guess, well, two things. One is I wonder what the parents and students in your classes say to you about this curriculum. And I'm sure that before you even get started, the curriculum in the abstract is something that they are probably concerned about if they do this beforehand. But if you are teaching it, you're in the middle of teaching it, or after the classes, I'd like to know what the parents may say to you about what they hear from their children about its value. That's one thing I wanted to ask or say. The other thing is, I would think local NPT stations should be interviewing you and putting this out there. I think this deserves broader representation than academic conferences.
Well, I appreciate that. To the first question, you know, amazingly, I I don't get a lot of feedback from parents. I don't get a lot of questions from parents. And I don't know I really don't know the answer as to why. I've been in Newberry for a long time. I've only ever taught at Newberry High School. I graduated from Newberry High School. My grandfather purchased our farm actually while he was serving as a prisoner of war in World War II. The Army was sending the money back to his mother, and he was buying the farm while he spent 9 months in a German prison camp. And so my family's roots in Newberry go back really deep. Every once in a while, somebody that's moved into Newberry in 5 years will say, "Hey, Mayor, man, we're losing our small town feel. What happened?" And I say, "Well, when did you get here?" Because I grew up in a very different Newberry. My grandfather was alive when there was a fence around Newberry to keep the cows out of the downtown area. So, maybe there's just a little bit of I don't want to engage Mr. Marlowe on that topic. My hope obviously is that they're all appreciating the curriculum and that they're glad that their kids are being challenged this way and that they're not seeing anything that they have to object to. But I do try to make sure that it's factual, that what I'm teaching these kids is just, these are just dates, these are names, these are people. If I tell you that the first person to die in the American Revolution was a man named Crispus Attucks, who was black, that's just a fact. You can look it up. That's just a fact. How you interpret that fact, what you do with that fact, maybe I'm getting into CRT at that point. But if I just ask the question and the kids say, "Well, that's kind of ironic that a black man would die for American freedom and then America would deny black people freedom." That's the kid's own realization. That's not me putting that into the kid. That's just me saying, first man to die for this was an African-American man, right? So hopefully there's enough structure to the class that if someone did say, "Hey, you are interpreting history for the kids and you're giving them your opinion," that I could say, "Well, actually, and I'm really always clear with my kids that I won't tell them my religion, I won't tell them my political party, I won't tell them any of my personal beliefs. That way I'm a blank slate and I can push them on all of these kinds of beliefs because I don't want to use the classroom as a tool for perpetuating my beliefs. I want them to come to their own thoughts and realizations." And the second was just a statement. So I'm glad to publicize Newberry's work and this far and wide. Anybody that wants to, I will brag about Newberry and what we're doing. And if the governor ever wants to come down and ask me any questions, I'm happy to chat with him.
Thank you very much for a wonderful talk. I just want to say that although my family has been here for 100 years, the Wynn family that I belong to does not have an E at the end of it.
I have a question. Are your classes pretty diverse with students?
They are. My African American, well, let me change that. My African American history class is almost a third black, a third Hispanic, a third white. All of my other AP classes are almost all white. And it's one of the things that we talk about in class. And I send the kids out to do surveys, and we go around to the different AP classes, and we take a head count, and we just count the population. Only 7% of educators in America are black. There's an organization in Gainesville as part of a national group. They're called the 100 Black Men of Gainesville. And their motto is they will be what they see. And I think that black kids don't see black teachers. I have students that don't have a black teacher until high school. And generally, the black teacher that they have is a coach, not a pure academic teacher. And so I think that black kids are in an institutional system that doesn't show them visibly that they can be successful, that they can be academic, because they don't see themselves in the teacher. So they see visibly that difference. And we have an African-American principal. So, I don't think we can blame the administration for only putting white kids in AP classes. I think that you have to dig a lot deeper in society to answer the question about, why is 95% of the AP classes white? when you have on-level classes that are, 80% Black.
How do you defend yourself or plan to defend yourself from being viewed as an object rather than as an individual? And that's part of the problem with racism, is that you sometimes see people not for what they are, but what you perceive them to be as an object. That dichotomy is something we're all struggling with. So when the politicians classify you, which they're likely to do, as being part of the problem, whatever that is, with the vague terms that they use, how do you combat that to see the individuality and the educational value that you're bringing to the classroom so that it can actually fight off that desire to make you an object?
I think that's a great question. And I guess I should say that if that ever happens, I would expect to lose. I think that when you look at the history of this, it's not the American happy ending fairy tale, right? I think that our judicial system is largely conservative. I think that the powers that are entrenched right now are entrenched specifically to support this agenda. So I wouldn't expect to necessarily win the fight that you are asking about. I am very I'm thinking about your question a lot, because as a mayor, that's generally, and as a teacher, kids don't see teachers as humans, right? We're the teacher, we're the enemy, it's us versus them. And people don't see politicians as human largely either, right? You're a mayor, you're a politician. I had a woman once, just bash me up and down because I was talking about inflation and how we were struggling and those kind of, she says, well, you politicians, y'all are all lining your pockets. And I said, ma'am, in Newberry, politicians are part-time. I'm a high school teacher, I know all about economic struggle. So how do you defend against being objectified? I really don't know that I know the answer to that, except in having the conversation, like I try to do with the community, and acknowledge that I understand your frustration about people listening to a white guy when you've tried to have this conversation for at least 20 years adamantly, probably 100 years that you've been trying. And now, here I am, and now you're listening. Now we're presenting at national conferences, right? That's got to be tough. So I don't know the answer except to just be honest about it and say, this is who I am. I think my accent helps a little bit. Mm-hmm. I think that's why I've been able to lead the country, because I kind of have one foot in the old world as a farmer and one foot in the new world. And so for better or worse, people have been willing to allow this conversation to happen. They haven't come down and voted me out. No one's ran against me. And I thought that was a very telling, because that was my very first term as mayor. We started this. And I thought, well, if the town doesn't want this, they'll let me know. I'll have an opponent. They'll vote me out. No one ran against me, and no one's run against me since then. I'm up for election, so I'm going to knock on wood.
We have another question in chat from Paul Parker. Is student feedback racially different with respect to meaning to them and appreciation of the course beyond gaining in high school college credit?
Yeah, I think absolutely. When we were talking about, we read The Hate You Give. Has anybody read that book? The Hate You Give is a great book. They did a movie. It's a pretty good movie too. Sometimes they don't coincide. But when you get to some of these conversations, even young Black people who have never experienced the kind of direct racism, right? No one's ever burned a cross on their yard. They've never seen a mob of people in white hoods. No one has ever just stood in front of a crowd and gave a racially motivated political speech and got roaring applause, right? They haven't seen that kind of racism. When you get to things like, like not being in an AP class, like dress codes for Black girls, right? Black girls get written up for dress code way more frequently than white girls get written up for dress code. And when you look at those studies, society tends to view young Black women as overly sexualized, as having way more sexual knowledge and experience than they actually do. And so that's probably one of the reasons why they get written up. And that conversation gets pretty heated, right? Because that's something that they have experienced. They see a young white student walking down in something that I don't do dress code because my eyes are up here. I'll let the female teachers handle that. But they'll see a young white girl walk around in something that could certainly be considered inappropriate for a school setting and not get a dress code referral. And they see a young black woman wearing something that's roughly equivalent and get written up for there. So I do see, I get that feedback, you know, that black kids are, you know, the teachers are much quicker to write referrals. I grew up in Tallahassee. My parents were divorced and my mom lived in Tallahassee and I lived with her until I was 13. I came to Newberry every other weekend. But my mother was fairly poor, and so we lived in the poorer section of Tallahassee. All my friends were black. And culturally, I think it is fair to say that as a group, black people are more boisterous. They're a little bit louder. They like to get up and move a little bit. If you've anybody ever been to a black family reunion? It's a ball. It's a lot of fun. There's softball games going on. They're barbecuing. There's loud music. People are loud. I go to my family reunion and we're all sitting there very quietly, sipping coffee or tea. And we're, you know, one person talks at a time, telling us what happened. And so I'm comfortable in both environments. I like the nice, quiet, right, reflection. And I also like the boisterous. So when black kids in my class, you know, need to get up and move, to me, I don't see that as defiance or them being disrespectful to me. I just see that as young teenagers who, you know, are growing and they have trouble sitting in an uncomfortable chair for 50 minutes, which you guys are probably starting to fall asleep at this point too, right? You've been sitting, you've been still for too long listening to someone else talk. Imagine that, you know, when you were 15 years old, right? You couldn't sit down. So I think that's a long answer to say yes.
And you can see that other question. I know you said your curriculum was offered in Gainesville, but how about other parts of Florida?
I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know. I know that we've been unsuccessful with Levy and Gilchrist County to date, although hope springs eternal, so we'll keep pushing. So I don't really know how many. I mean, it's done by districts, so each school board has an option to engage in this. You know, and the governor will rightly say that he's mandated this. But, you know, as with most government mandates with education, they go, that's why I'm not really concerned about the AP, right? I have a long history of ignoring Tallahassee when it comes to the classroom. And so I know he's mandated it, but I don't know how much people are going and doing that.
What are the 4 high schools in Alachua County that are?
So Newberry High School, every high school has the curriculum and every high school knows that we want them to teach it. We're advocating for them to teach it. We're not trying to hide secrets. So Newberry High School, Buchholz, GHS, Eastside, Santa Fe. Am I missing one? PK Young does have it because of the partnership with UF. And I haven't thought about Oak Hall, although I gave a presentation at Oak Hall about this very subject. And we worked with them. They were doing a African-American art show. And so I shared it with them. I have to follow up and find out if they've actually taught it.
I have a question about your experience in all of this. What does it teach you to encourage all of us to how we can relate to our school boards and elected officials in dealing with sort of the truth and reconciliation process and the way that the race is taught in our schools?
If I'm understanding the question correctly, I mean, I think what I would hope is that everybody in this room understands that we have been raised in a society that is racialized. This comment of, I don't see race, I just see character, I think does a disservice, because it would be like saying, I don't see that you're a woman, I just see you as a person. Well, if I don't see your gender, I don't see you, right? Being a woman is central to who you are. Being black is central to you. Being white is central to who I am, right? I have to live in my own skin. So communicating with the school board and saying, you know, these are things that we need to accept. These are things that we don't need to hide from. So yes, let's talk about race publicly. Let's talk about truth and reconciliation. Let's talk about teaching African American history. My day one lesson in that class is that I object to the title. It's not African American history, it's just American history. It's told through a different lens. That's it. Thank you. I appreciate that. My students never do that for me. So, but you know, when we learn about Thomas Jefferson, you know, we learn this is the man who wrote the immortal lines, right? That are also very paradoxical, right? As you are in the middle of owning other human beings. So it's not African American history. It's just American history. It's just being told through a different lens. That's it. So if we can understand that, then if the governor had objected to AP African American history because he said, hey, we already teach American history, we're just going to revamp American history to include other voices, that may have been a position I could have got behind, right?
I will. Thank you so much, Mayor Marlowe.
I appreciate it. Thank you guys. Y'all been a very kind audience. Very kind.
All right, thank you everyone on Zoom for joining us, and we'll see you in the spring semester.